Hi everyone, welcome to Toronto Data Workshop. Today we're joined by Belinda Lee. Belinda is a PhD candidate at MIT and she's affiliated with the Language and Intelligence Lingo Lab. So her work focuses on improving human interpretability, reliability, and usability of language models. And she's funded by a NDSEC fellowship and a Clare Booth Luce graduate fellowship. Before her time at MIT, she spent a year at Facebook AI Applied Research, and before that, she has an undergraduate degree in computer science from the University of Washington. Thank you very much for joining us, Belinda.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, hold on, let me. Oop, okay, um, oop. Okay, can folks see my screen?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so hi everyone. Again, my name is Belinda. And today I'll be talking about some work that looks at, eliciting tasks and preferences with language models. And specifically, I'm going to be looking at whether language models can be used to interact with users and ask clarifying questions. And I'm going to be going through two papers first. First one, we look at whether we can prompt language models to ask questions. The second one, we see if we can integrate, notions of Bayesian uncertainty. And finally, if there's time, I'll touch upon some work that looks at task elicitation for embodied tasks. Okay, so suppose someone tells you to write a fun song. How do you go about doing this? Well, we can break tasks down generally into two steps. So the first step is we want to understand what the user's goal and preferences are here. And the second step is we actually act to fulfill the goal. And this first step is what we call task or preference elicitation. And we say that task elicitation is challenging because there might be ambiguity here. So for example, in this task, we don't actually know, what the user considers fun. We don't know exactly like what the user considers to be, what the limits of the environment are. If we're a language model, right? Like we probably want to produce the lyrics of a song, etc. So the specific task that the user wants to accomplish here is ambiguous. And task ambiguity occurs when the user specification to the model is ambiguous, meaning the model is unable to perfectly fulfill the user's requests. And this can occur in many scenarios. As we saw before, this could occur if there's unknown personal preferences of the user. This can occur in situations where there's ambiguous, moral boundaries. This can occur when the task is too complex to be fully specified in a prompt or makes use of specialized knowledge that the user might not know that they need to specify. So we'll see examples of all of these in the next few slides. But we begin by asking, what sorts of behaviors do current language models exhibit in the presence of ambiguity? And my argument is that what current language models do is not optimal. It can be like either frustrating or, actively harmful. Okay, so in the first case, ambiguity and personalization, suppose we have a user that says, like generate code for my personal website that really shows off my unique aesthetic taste. So this task is ambiguous because the user's aesthetic taste is unknown to the model ahead of time. And so what GPT 3.5 Turbo and GPT 4o, both of them do is they actually just straight up, generate a few hundred lines of code and make implicit assumptions about what the user might like. So you can see GPT 4o here generates a modern minimalist design with a touch of elegance. And this may or may not be what the user enjoys. So one mode of what the model does in the presence of ambiguity is this thing known as imperfect fulfillment, which is they make assumptions about what the user likes, which may or may not be true. The second thing, so in the second case, we look at safety. So for example, a user says, how would I unlock a locked car door? So here ambiguity arises because it's not clear whether this request is harmful or not. And so two different language models, so Llama 3 just basically rejects this request. It says, I cannot provide information for illegal or harmful activities. And this can be frustrating for a user who's just looking to, they got locked out of their car, and they're just looking to enter their own car. And then GPT-4o actually goes ahead and fulfills the request and gives the detailed procedure about how go into a locked car. And obviously this can be used for malignant applications. Okay, so what other sorts of ambiguity are there? Well, when the task is too complex, generally, it's really hard for a user to be able to fully comprehensively specify, all of their preferences, all of the details of the task they want to accomplish. So for example, here, the user might not have the medical knowledge necessary. So they might say like, I have a fever and cough, what medication would you recommend? There's probably more details of symptoms that they need to report, but the user doesn't have that medical knowledge to know like what sort of symptoms should I be reporting here. The tasks might be too complex to fully specify. So for example, the user wants the AI model to coordinate relief plans after an earthquake, etc. There might be a lot of factors here that affect how this coordination happens. And the user might simply not have enough, time or like space to be able to like fully articulate all of these points. Or there might be like a lot of complex edge cases, right? So if the user wants to like, write a program that checks the validity of street addresses, there's a lot of edge cases to this. Like there's every single country, every single region has a different format of address. This could change over time. So these edge cases, yeah, are hard to like fully be able to specify. So generally speaking, the way that people have been thinking about like language model outputs, AI model outputs, has been on this very like one-dimensional axes in this very binary way. So language model outputs are generally classified as either harmful or helpful. And for harmful requests, the language model, straight up rejects the request and says like something like, sorry, but as an AI language model, I can't do blah, blah, blah. And then for helpful requests, it goes ahead and fulfills the request. Yeah, so I want to argue that there are other ways to do, instead of this binary fulfill reject, in the presence of ambiguity, it's actually more natural for people to, ask clarifying questions, right? So in the personalization application, if we're generalizing a personalized website, we could ask follow-up questions like, what sorts of colors do you like, or what would you like your website to feel like, instead of generating an example and making an assumption about what the user likes. In the safety example, we can ask, why do you actually want to unlock a car door, and make a judgment based on that. And then for complex tasks, we could use, the massive knowledge that language models have from their pre-training to be able to like identify what is the salient information we need here to be able to like potentially recommend a medication or something, right? We can ask about what, certain additional symptoms. So another way we can think about this is by asking questions, we are offloading some parts of the task specification to the AI model. So basically in conventional approaches, there are like these two different types of classical approaches. So there's prompting, right, where we give a natural language description of the task to, a language model. We tell it what we want it to do. And, this here, the burden of like specifying the task falls entirely on the user. Like they have to write the entire description in a single prompt. In dataset design, like someone has to go in and collect, a bunch of these unlabeled examples. And then they have to like spend a bunch of time and effort in annotating these examples. And once again, the burden of the task specification like falls entirely on like the annotator or the person doing this dataset curation. So basically, we call the process of task elicitation as like some way of automating parts of specifying the task. for example, by asking questions. Yeah, so let's formalize this process. So a task we define as a function that maps from inputs to outputs. And we call fully unambiguous tasks. These are fully disambiguated tasks. So for example, content recommendation for Avery is a task. Content recommendation for Pat is a task. And then we call a domain a general class of tasks that could be ambiguous. So under the content recommendation domain, like these two personalized tasks fall under this domain. A task specification we define as a way of communicating the desired task to a model. So as we saw before, there was prompting, there was data set design, and then we're going to talk about other sorts of ways. And then task elicitation we define as the process of deriving a task specification from a user. So what do we want out of a task elicitation method? So there are four sorts of factors that we want to kind of optimize here. We want to be able to invoke from the user an accurate task specification that is comprehensive and generalizable across many different environments and inputs. But we also want to consider how quickly and how burdensome it is for the user to be able to provide this specification. Right, so there's a trade-off between these factors. The more time the user spends on crafting the task specification, the generally more accurate and comprehensive it should be. Okay, so basically we measure factors 1 and 2 by accuracy on the held out set, and then we measure 3 and 4 by how human interaction time with the method. And so generally, if we plot these two, if we plot human time spent against test set accuracy, we should see curves like this, where as the human spends more time, the test set accuracy of the specification increases. But we also want to reward methods that get to higher accuracies faster. So in this case, method 2 should be considered better than method 1. And so we craft this metric called time integrated delta accuracy, which is a fancy way of saying the area under this curve here. And so methods with higher areas under the curve are better. Okay, so we can broadly categorize existing task elicitation methods along two axes. So there's static versus interactive, which is basically just saying, over the course of the interaction, do we evolve as we see what the user is saying? And then the second axis is, are we using real examples or are we allowing the user to provide free-form inputs? So these can be things like descriptions, synthetic examples, conversation turns, etc. So in the quadrant, so static and real examples, there's data set design, which we saw before was labeling, a bunch of examples. And then in the quadrant of interactive and real examples, there's active learning, which is similar, to labeling examples, but as the model gets more and more information about the user, it can actually select, what to present next to the user, such that it maximizes the amount of information that it's learning from the user. In the static and freeform inputs, we have prompting. So here, the user writes a natural language description of their task. And recently there's also multimodal prompting, so the user can give images in their prompt. And in the interactive and freeform inputs quadrant, that is currently empty. And that is going to be kind of the focus of this talk, right? So how do we combine the advantages of interactively being able to elicit from the user with the advantages of having free-form inputs? Okay, so this first work that I'm going to be talking about is GATE, Generative Active Task Elicitation. It was done in collaboration with folks at Stanford. And yeah, you can read more in the paper here. But yeah, so basically in GATE, what we're looking at is how do we prompt language models to be able to interactively ask questions, present synthetic examples to users. And so basically we're asking, what can current language models, what are they good at doing? And we see that we can prompt language models to be able to synthesize examples. So just by prompting alone, we can get language models to, ask questions like generate synthetic examples and present them to the user for labeling. We can also prompt language models to ask yes or no questions. So for example, here it's generating, all these yes or no questions about what the user likes and dislikes. And we can also prompt language models to ask open-ended questions. And language models are also good at taking in, open-ended answers as well. So we call this first class of approaches generative active learning. So similar in spirit to pool-based active learning, except instead of using real examples, we're using these synthetic examples. We call this second class of approaches generative yes-no questions. And we call this third class of approaches generative open-ended questions. And in all of these, what we're simply doing is we're prompting the language model to quote unquote ask, the most informative next question or synthesize the most informative next example. So we evaluate GATE on 3 domains, kind of based on like examining, when might task ambiguity arise. So the first situation that task ambiguity might arise in is personalization domains. So here we focused on content recommendation, trying to figure out like what sorts of articles a user would like to read. The second case that task ambiguity arises is the fuzzy, moral situations. So here we construct a moral reasoning domain where we try to figure out, for different users, what situations would they find it ethical to like steal a loaf of bread. And then the third situation where there's ambiguity is complex tasks. So here we look specifically at email address validation, what strings can be valid email addresses. There's a whole list of specifications that the user may or may not have thought through. So is GATE an effective and accurate elicitation paradigm for those prior 3 domains? So here what we're plotting is kind of the time integrated delta accuracy we saw before. And we're plotting it against 3 baselines. So we have supervised learning, which is basically data set design. We have the model, we have the user annotate yes or no for each training example. We have pool-based active learning where, we select the most informative example from a pool. And then we have prompting, which, the user writes a task specification. And then we compare these 3 baselines against the 3 GATE methods. And we find that generally speaking, GATE is more, efficient and accurate at eliciting tasks compared to these prior approaches. And it's a statistically significant difference, especially in the content and email domains. Is GATE easy to interact with? So at the end of the interaction process, we had users fill out a survey about how mentally demanding they found interacting with each elicitation method. And we find that with the exception of, answering open-ended questions, generally speaking, GATE methods are less mentally demanding than particularly prompting and supervised learning. Okay, and then finally we look at does over the course of this interaction, does the language model actually influence the user's preferences to be easier to predict? So specifically, we're looking, at this study by Kruger et al., which noticed this phenomenon called auto-induced distribution shifts, which is saying that, like, as if machine learning models are able to affect their environment, they sometimes do so in a way to make the task easier, right? They might be able to influence human behavior to be easier to predict. So to be able to measure this, what we do is for each test example, so each of the points here is a test example, we measure for non-interactive methods, so basically prompting-based approaches, what is the proportion that users answered yes to that test example. And then we compare that against on the y-axis for gate-based approaches, what is the percentage of users that answered yes. And we find that these points generally lie along a y=x curve, which indicates that there's probably not a significant effect on user predictions. Okay, so takeaways from GATE, prompting language models to elicit tasks, through asking them to generate examples and questions, results in more useful task specifications per unit of human time, compared to prompting and data set design. And it also requires less effort on the user's part to craft the task specification. So next we ask, can we use more principled approaches rather than prompting to guide question generation? And that's what we do in the follow-up work. So here we're combining advantages of language models with more rigorous Bayesian-based approaches. And again, you can read more in the paper here. So we call this approach OPEN, which stands for Optimal Preference Elicitation with Natural Language. And OPEN is premised on this sort of observation that language models are good at some sorts of tasks, but they're not so good at other sorts of problems. So the things language models are good at, they're good at being pretty general across domains. They're good at synthesizing natural sounding queries, questions to users, and being able to parse open-ended kind of natural language responses. And they have a pretty good prior over average human preferences, since they've been pre-trained on this entire population of human outputs. Now, what are language models not so good at? Well, they're not so good at solving optimization problems and quantifying uncertainty. So they're not good at optimizing mathematical notions of informativity, for example. And they're also not so good at modeling and tracking specific fine-grained human preferences. And we see whether we can, so in this work, what we're doing is we're trying to offload the things that language models aren't so good at to a Bayesian model. And specifically, we observe that Bayesian models are good at these three things. Okay, so what we do is we combine the complementary benefits of large language models with Bayesian optimal experimental design. And basically, Bayesian optimal experimental design, what we're trying to do here is make optimum decisions under uncertainty. So we begin with a model of kind of the process that determines an experimental outcome. And based on this, so in our case, that is going to be the human preference. And based on that, we design an experiment that is going to be optimally informative of the thing that we want to get, right? The human preference. And then we run that experiment, we present a question to the user, and we observe what the user responds with. We observe whether the user likes an article or not. And then based on this, we can update our model of the user preference. Yeah, so we'll go into this in more detail in the next few slides, but this is kind of a high-level overview of BOED. Okay, so before we dive into the specifics of how our method works, just some preliminary assumptions that we make here. So first, in this work, we're assuming a linear model of preferences over a set of features. So for each article, for example, there's a set of salient features, does it contain sports or science? And then we have a set of feature values for each of these features. And then so we suppose that preferences are represented in a vector. And by taking the dot product of this feature vector and the preference vector, we can get a rough score for how much the user likes this article or not. And here we're also looking at pairwise choices. So we're using a Bradley-Terry model of pairwise choices, which basically means that the probability that the user likes one article over another is a function of the sigmoid of the preference score of one article minus the preference score of the second article. And this is a fairly common in the literature, a fairly common way of modeling pairwise preferences. Okay, so returning back to the BOED loop. So in our case, we're modifying this. So the model is the preference, our belief about the preference vector. The design is the optimal query that we want to ask the user, and the experiment is actually, asking the user that query. And in addition, we prepend 2 steps to this framework. So to be able to make this framework more domain general, we need a step that actually, gives us the salient features, and then is able to initialize this preference belief model. And we'll see how we do this in the next 2 slides. Okay, so the first step is we want to be able to featureize the domain. So this step is accomplished by simply prompting the language model for task relevant features. And it's based on the premise that language models, are generally able to model like preferences across a population. So they generally know like what features are salient for an average human. So as an example, here we're asking the language model to generate, 10 features that might explain their decision when doing content choosing an article to read. Sorry. And yeah, it generates a list of 10 features. And then step 2 is we want to initialize user preferences over these features. So if you notice here in our prompt, we ask the language model to order each feature from like most to least influential on their decision. And so generally what we do is we assume basically a normal distribution over each of these features, right? So the distribution of preferences is taken from this sort of like Gaussian normal distribution, where each feature is centered on 0, 0, but then features higher up in the list, means that people generally probably have more polarized opinions on them. So for the ones higher up in the list, they have the highest variance, and then we linearly like decay the variance as we go down the list. Okay, right. So based on our current, model of the preference of the distribution across preference vectors, we select the optimal query that we're gonna ask by optimizing the expected information gain. So we sample a bunch of like these, pairs of like feature vectors, which represent pairs of examples, and we compute the EIG. So basically, right, so we are maximizing over feature vectors, and we're taking like, the uncertainty of, so we're taking the current uncertainty, and then we're selecting the feature vector that maximizes the reduction in uncertainty, based on our current beliefs about what the user's preferences are. Okay, so once we have selected some feature vector, sorry. Right. We can't just present this pair of feature vectors to a user, right? Because it's like very unnatural for a user to interact with feature vectors. So what we do is we prompt the language model to actually generate examples based on this pair of feature vectors. So you can see here, we prompt it with kind of the features that are like non-zero. And then ChatGPT is actually pretty good at generating examples that conform to like this pair of feature vectors. And then we get a response from the human. Okay, so after we get a response from the human, we can use this response to actually update our beliefs about, what the user's preferences are. And so specifically, we do this Bayesian update, which, we try to figure out what the posterior probability of the preference is, given that the user answered option A here. But generally speaking, this computation is intractable over all preferences. So we approximate it with a particle filter. So we subsample, potential like preference vectors that the user could have based on our current prior distribution. And then we reweight each particle based on this, Bayesian computation, and then we refit a normal distribution over the reweighted particles. Okay, so we run this full loop several times until we get a generally, good model of the preference beliefs, of the preference vectors. And once we have this, we can use this distribution of preference vectors to make predictions on test samples. So for each test sample, for each pair of test samples, we featureize it with a language model, get a featureized pair, and then we compute the one that is, basically we select the one that maximizes the expected probability under the current model of the preferences. Okay, so here we're looking specifically at content recommendation. So we have a bunch of like real articles and we're pairing them against each other. And so for content recommendation, we find that open is generally more effective than gate. So gate, if you recall, is a simply prompting-based approach. So here we did like a similar setup where we prompted language models to ask pairized questions and make predictions based on that. And that was actually really bad. But even with the best gate setting, which was like prompting language models to ask open-ended questions, open outperforms even that setting. So yeah, open is generally more effective. And then we ask, where does this gain come from, right? So we ablate so there are two parts to open, right? There was the part of like using Bayesian models to ask questions, and then there was the part of like using the final preferences to make predictions. And actually we find that generally speaking, the gain comes primarily from using open to make predictions. But these benefits are complementary. So once we have like a good model that makes predictions, then we see additional gains if we ask, the most uncertain question at each turn. But this surprisingly maybe kind of shows that language models are bad at tracking preferences over turns, especially if, at each turn we're getting new information and we have to update that. So language models are bad at doing that. Okay, and finally, we examine, do we need that language model at all? Like, what if we just did BOED and, presented feature vectors to humans instead of like having the language model synthesize examples for humans to pick? And humans are really bad at looking at feature vectors. So yeah, using language models to synthesize, natural examples is useful for elicitation. Okay, so basically, the takeaways from open is that we find that Bayesian approaches are helpful for both tracking human preferences across turns and optimizing for the next question to ask. While meanwhile, language models provide a natural interface for users to interact with. And by combining the advantages of both approaches, we get a better task elicitation framework than either approach in isolation. Okay, so I guess in the next few minutes, since I have a little bit of time, I guess, I'm going to talk about like more embodied tasks, right? So up to this point, we've only been looking at natural language tasks, but can similar sort of task elicitation frameworks be useful for embodied tasks? Okay, so this work, preference conditioned language guided abstractions, led by Andy Penn, is looking at whether we can kind of get this thing called an abstraction, a task abstraction for embodied tasks to be able to disambiguate the task. And you can read more, of course, in the paper. So many embodied tasks can be specified in natural language. So for example, throwing away the can, you generally expect a robot to do something like that. But there might be context-dependent underspecified preferences. So for example, you might observe a demonstration like this. Right, and so why are the trajectories different here? Well, you can probably conclude that there is a hidden preference here that the user never specified that you don't want to be stepping on any drills. And specifically here, the important thing is the reason we were able to find that difference, the reason we were able to find that salient feature was that we were looking at pairs of demonstrations and how they differed. So relying on that same principle, so basically here what we're saying is that it's important to identify salient features of a task, to be able to learn to be able to disambiguate what the task is, it is important to identify salient features. So we begin by looking at this, totally kind of unambiguous task, bring me a fruit here. And suppose, the language model brings, or sorry, suppose that the robot brings the orange here. And here we can generally tell that it's like the object identity is the salient feature for this task. But when there's an unambiguous task, right? When there's an ambiguous task, like bring me something I would like, when we see the robot picking up the orange, we actually don't know what the salient feature is. So even if we see a demonstration, it's not going to be generalizable until we have the salient feature. Okay, so in our approach, what we want to do is we want to be able to get all these salient features to be able to learn a generalizable policy. And basically what we do is we use language models to both kind of infer what salient features might be and also ask humans about salient features. So once again, we're looking at differences between trajectories, which is able to help us like disambiguate what the salient feature is. So if like the current trajectory we have so far differs from the human trajectory, we prompt a language model to generate features that potentially explain the difference. But if the language model is super uncertain about that, then we present that pair to the human and we ask the human for the salient feature. And we're looking at 3 sorts of ambiguous tasks here. We're looking at picking up, pick up my favorite food, place the mug down on my preferred dish, sweep the food into the sink while avoiding my special object. Yeah, and we find that compared to passive PLGA, which is not asking the user questions, just using the language model to make inferences about features, and compared to passive LGA, which is completely just conditioning on the language description itself, and not even looking at these pairs of demonstrations. Active PLGA performs the best. So being able to elicit these salient features interactively outperforms, simply using a language model prior, or, not eliciting for ambiguous features. Okay, so to kind of like summarize the past few slides, task elicitation is difficult, prompts can be ambiguous and underspecified, and labeling data is costly. So we introduced 3 approaches for task elicitation to try to mediate this trade-off a little bit. So in GATE, we use language models to prompt language models to kind of interact with users by asking questions, by synthesizing examples to try to elicit task specifications. And we find that, this prompted interaction is per unit time more effective than both prompting and labeling data. And then we further improved upon GATE by introducing a Bayesian model to try to like optimize for things that language models aren't good at. And then finally, we introduced an approach for embodied tasks. We use language models to elicit features for these embodied tasks. Okay, so looking ahead, I think what we really want is a natural way, the far goal is like we want a natural way for humans to interact with language models, right? So in this work, in these 3 works, we kind of introduced alternatives to like, outright denying requests versus like outputting misaligned responses in the form of asking clarifying questions. So language models themselves, are not organically trained to ask questions, but that could be something that we could train them to do, or we could do these inference approaches to try to make them ask questions. And yeah, I think also in the future, like automatically being able to determine like what is the threshold of certainty that I can actually act on versus like when do I just keep continuing to ask for clarification. That's also something that is, you know, potential future work. Um, is there some sort of like exploitation trade-off? Do language models already internally model the user's goals and beliefs? We saw in open that they were really bad at doing this. So maybe we do need an external module to do this. But would this ability like be emergent with scale, or do we need different kinds of training, for example? And finally, how do we be able to, how can we deal with more complex personal preferences, right? Like the domain that Gate had the most trouble in was this moral situations domain. Probably because, that was the most complex one with most like potentially contradictory factors. So how do we deal with these potentially, competing factors in real world preferences? And how might we, be able to counterbalance, for example, if there's like personal preferences that differ from like collectively socially good preferences, right? And obviously, like people, companies nowadays think of like people shouldn't be able to maliciously use, these tools to be able to do whatever. So they impose some sort of boundaries, but also who gets to decide like what these boundaries are and where they lie. So yeah, generally all like interesting questions. And I think there's lots of space for future work, future exploration in this space. And I'm happy to hear like what everyone else, has thoughts on, what everyone else, whether there's anything I can clarify. Yeah, discuss any of the questions here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Belinda. It was a fascinating talk, and I can't believe the complexity. I feel like you managed to boil it down to something that I feel like I understood. I'm not sure whether I actually understood it or not, but I really appreciate you making that effort. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you. But maybe just to get us started, you traverse such a wide variety of work in this talk, and obviously this is just the tip of the iceberg. If you look at your website, there's a lot more. What's the general theory of Belinda Lee? Like, what's motivating you here, in terms of your research?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I'd say that generally speaking, I guess this line of research is kind of the question that I put, like this first question that I put here, which is like, how do we actually want to think about like, users, people interacting with AI systems, with language models? And specifically, I think one of the ways forward, right, is like we have personalized language models or personalized AI system. And we're increasingly seeing like more and more attention paid on that. But to be able to do that, right, we want to also be able to like adapt to fine-grained, users' preferences, fine-grained user specifications. And I think that's something that's really difficult for current language models because they've been trained on this population of humans. So they're basically being trained to, model average humans. They're not trained to model specific humans.
Are there any other questions from folks? Feel free to raise your hand and I can call on you. With the second paper that you presented, are you able to talk through like a motivating example? Like when would if I'm the New York Times, is this something that I'm interested in using, or just in simple language?
Yeah, sure. Uh, so I guess maybe I'll put this up. Um, yeah, so I think generally, like, if, for example, we want to, um, like be able to model like a generic human preference, right? Um, and we're supposing that like there's, yeah, so we're supposing that like we want to be able to like very quickly derive what the human's preferences are, without too much effort from the human. Then we want to at each step be able to ask a question that is most informative about like what the preferences are. So basically the premise of, I guess, the second method is we're like keeping track of a potential like distribution over what the human's preferences might be. And based on what we currently know about the human, we pick the question that is like that will like make this distribution the most narrow, make this distribution like increase information gain basically. So yeah, we're um basically tracking the user's preferences across these questions and then using that to ask like the most informative question. I don't know if that was a useful or not. Do you want like a more specific fine-grained example?
If one comes to mind, but otherwise,
Yeah, I guess so I suppose for like content recommendation, right? Like we have what we have is like we have like maybe yeah, so I guess maybe if we think of just maybe like one feature for now, so like does the user like sports articles or not? And we have like a potential distribution like so we start with like a distribution centered on 0, 0. So like maybe we have no information about whether the user likes sports articles or not, and there's like this normal distribution centered on 0, 0. And then based on that, we ask a question, like we present, an article with sports and an article without sports, because that will give us the most information about whether the user likes sports articles or not. So we give that to the user. And then if the user picks the sports articles, then we can move the distribution towards like positive sports. The user does like sports. And if the user picks the non-sports articles, then we put a negative weight on sports because the user probably doesn't like sports. So maybe that's a more clarifying example.
yeah, absolutely. Um, so you could imagine, say, Netflix implementing this.
Right.
So
Yeah.
they put up two options. They're like, which movie do you want to watch tonight? If I click Action Man, then they're going to give me more of that, and if I click The Godfather, then they're going to give me more of that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And your particular contribution here is like adding in the Bayesian aspect, which allows you to sort of update that and make something that's specific to me.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, um, yeah, I guess the specific contribution is both the Bayesian aspect and also the language model aspect of like, because these things are feature vectors. Um, it's not very easy for humans to interact with like just giant vectors of values. It's easier if they just see real examples. So it's adding this language model component on top of this kind of Bayesian loop to be able to like generate real examples.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone have any other questions that they'd like to ask? Feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you. Jules?
Oh, I
You're
think you're muted.
muted at the moment. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Hello. Um, Thank you so much, Belinda. My name is Jules. I'm a grad student in the Masters of Information program at U of T. And right now I'm working on my master's thesis. And so we're looking at the role of a facilitator in an interdisciplinary research setting, supporting researchers in early stage research, and how they might be supported or augmented using LLMs. And
Mhm.
so I've been experimenting just with GPT-4o to see how the model can, I think we're really focusing on the open-ended questions piece.
Mhm.
And something I found so far in just experimenting is that like by giving the LLM a list of like an empty list of specifications, and saying, elicit info, pretend you're to the LLM, pretend that you're a facilitator and I'm a client and you're eliciting information from me. Try to gather as much information as you can from this list and then provide a recommendation from a tool or method from this list of tools or methods. So we're breaking it into 2 steps. First is like, how well can the LLM generate this list of specifications? And then the second piece is, given that list of specifications, what recommendation does it make from this list?
Yeah.
And I found when I first was experimenting and putting in that empty specifications list, it started going through one by one and asking yes, no questions. But I stopped it pretty quickly and just said, okay, how can, please have a conversation with me to elicit this information. And it very quickly turned into this very conversational, asking a couple questions, really loose, kind of validating me as I went as the user, you know, oh, that's a really good idea. This sounds complicated. We'll keep that in mind, you know, and then kept asking questions. And then, so I just wanted to ask you, given this, like, as an example, where do you see like open or gate, like where can I experiment with those as part of my project?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think you've probably already done like a lot of gate already, since you've been like, gate is just, you know, prompting language models to have conversations, and it seems like what you already did, right? So yeah, I think that's really great. But also, like, I think one thing that basically what Open found was that language models, they're not like, if what you want is to be able to like optimally elicit these sorts of specifications, you know, in a way that's like, at each step, I'm not going to just ask about any attribute. I'm going to ask about something that's like the most informative for me. Then you might consider like keeping some sort of, even if it doesn't have to be Bayesian, but like keeping track of like, maybe there are certain factors, like, you know, a checklist of things that I need to ask about, and making sure I like ask about all of them. Yeah, and just like, you know, I guess one thing we found with Gate also is that like over the course of conversation, as we get into like, I think 10 plus, you know, conversational turns, it starts getting repetitive sometimes. So just making sure that that doesn't happen. But yeah, I'd say generally, like, I think it's good to, you know, experiment with these things, experiment with prompting, but also, you know, like consider sort of approaches that, you know, might be able to like do some things that language models can't, like being able to track, you know, what the user's preferences are over time.
Awesome, thank you. And do you have any references that speak to that, like the turns in a conversation and that repetition piece? Like, is there data about that, or is that just something that you found in your research?
Yeah, that was something that uh I guess at least I found. I don't think I have the exact transcripts here, but like, I think especially with the where are the 3 domains? So especially like in the email domain, at some point it just ended up, because interaction with this was relatively fast, it would get into like 20, 30 turns. And by the end, sometimes it would just be generating like kind of permutations of different like dots or something, you know, like just asking kind of the same type of question over and over again. And I think that's because, you know, at some point it, instead of asking like the most informative question, it just learns to copy from prior context. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Hope that was helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Are there any other quick questions while we've got Belinda? Finally, just a quick, easy one to end on. So you note on your website that you do dance and bouldering. So how does that how does what you learn there influence your research? Are there any lessons that you take away?
Hmm. Uh, yeah, maybe I guess like, you know, if we have AI models in the future that can like kind of, like, I guess one thing that actually we were brainstorming tasks with Andy when we were doing the like in-body task setting. And one of the tasks we were brainstorming was like, what if we had, AI systems that could design an optimal workout for someone, right? And so like, if in the future an AI system could be like, okay, here's the optimal workout for someone who likes dance and bouldering, then that's kind of the dream vision for like an AI assistant.
Thank you very much for your time, especially as you're giving up your time while you're on vacation. Really appreciate your talk, and best of luck with your current studies. Thank you
Yeah, of
very much,
course.
Belinda.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye.
All right, see ya.